We just talked about the trade-offs that are implied by the technology that is used to produce the two goods in this economy, consumption and leisure. Now we're going to turn to look at the consumer's problem a little more closely than we have. So remember that the consumer is going to maximize utility, which depends on consumption and leisure, subject to this budget constraint, which says that consumption equals W times H minus L is labor income, plus the profits that the consumer receives from the firms, minus the lump sum taxes that the consumer pays. What we said before was that the consumer will optimally choose this consumption bundle C star L star at point E, given the wage W. Now, what I want to emphasize is that we can actually say more than this. First of all, the slope of this budget line is negative W. It's the wage, negative the wage. And what W gives us is the rate at which the consumer can substitute leisure, which is on the horizontal axis, for consumption, which is on the vertical axis. And that's what the slope of this budget line is telling you. Consumers' preferences, which are given by the utility function, U of CL, determine the rate at which the consumer is willing to trade off leisure for consumption. Now, in an equilibrium, these two rates, the rate at which they're willing to trade off and the rate at which they can trade off, have to be the same. So now the consumer's willingness to trade off leisure and consumption is called the marginal rate of substitution. And we abbreviate it as MRS. And because it's the marginal rate of substitution of leisure for consumption, we put little subscripts LC. So the consumer's optimal choice is going to have to be to set the marginal rate of substitution equal to the wage. So let's just do the math for a second, and then we'll get into the economics. So you can describe what the consumer is doing as maximizing this function, U of CL, subject to the budget constraint. But now what you can do is use the budget constraint to just substitute for C into this equation, into this function, the utility function. And then the consumer is now just choosing L in order to maximize this. Well, as some of you may remember from your calculus, to find a maximum, you differentiate and then you set it equal to 0. And when you do that, after you simplify, you get that this partial derivative, this is the marginal utility of leisure up here, and this is the marginal utility of consumption. And that ratio is the marginal rate of, whoops, this is a typo. This is the marginal rate of substitution of leisure for consumption. And that has to equal the wage. So that's the mathematics of it, which may or may not be helpful to you. So let's think a little harder about what is this marginal rate of substitution. So remember that a consumer wants diversity in her consumption bundle. And the marginal rate of substitution tells how many units of leisure the consumer requires in order to give up 1 unit of consumption. So if the consumer has a lot of consumption and only a little bit of leisure, then she's going to be willing to give up a whole bunch of consumption in order to get some leisure. On the other hand, if the consumer has only a little bit of consumption and a lot of leisure, then she won't be willing to give up very much consumption in order to get more leisure. So this reasoning implies that the marginal rate of substitution between leisure and consumption diminishes as leisure increases. And this diminishing marginal rate of substitution stems directly from diminishing marginal utility, which many of you have already seen in your micro courses, but this is analogous to the diminishing marginal product of labor that we saw on the firm side. So why is it that equating the marginal rate of substitution to the wage maximizes utility. Well, here I think this language is really important. So the marginal rate of substitution is the willingness to substitute. The wage is the ability to substitute. So suppose they weren't equal. Again, we're using the same logic that we used on the firm side for profit maximization. So in particular, suppose that the marginal rate of substitution is equal to 2 and the wage is equal to 1. Well, then this says that you're willing to give up 2 units of consumption in order to get 1 unit of leisure. But the market says that 2 units of consumption can exchange for 2 units of leisure. Well, then you're going to want to substitute out of consumption and into leisure. Diminishing marginal rate of substitution then implies that the marginal rate of substitution is going to fall as you increase leisure. And you want to continue to make this substitution, substituting consumption in exchange for leisure, until the marginal rate of substitution equals the wage.